studios of KPFK Pacifica Radio in Los Angeles, this is Uprising, and I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It's Tuesday, July 21st, 2015. A small Palestinian village in the West Bank is under threat of demolition by Israel. We'll speak with activist Huwaida Arraf about the campaign to Save Susiya. And political prisoner and journalist Mumia Abu Jamal reads from his new book, Writing on the Wall. Plus, Kevin AlexanderGrain joins us for a conversation covering the Netroots Nation confrontation of Liberal Democratic presidential candidates by Black Lives Matter activists, as well as the mysterious police custody death of Sandra Bland. That's coming up after the news. Joining us now to analyze today's headlines is Robert Jensen. He's an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. Hi, Bob.
Hello, Sonali.
Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has angered U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry after he made vitriolic comments in a speech denouncing the nuclear agreement between the two nations. Khamenei has not yet endorsed the deal and said in his speech that the U.S.'s goals are 180 degrees compared to Iran's. His response is not unlike that of U.S. Republicans who also oppose the deal. Meanwhile, North Korea, who like Iran is considered an enemy of the U.S., has ruled out a similar style deal for itself. North Korea says it is developing nuclear weapons to defend itself from U.S. aggression. A spokesperson said this week that the country, quote, is not interested at all in the dialogue to discuss the issue of making it freeze or dismantle its nukes unilaterally, end of quote. Well, Bob, aren't such nuclear deals simply ways to preserve U.S. political and military power, even if they do make the world a safer place?
Well, I think it's obvious that U.S. power in the Middle East is on the wane, and that this deal with Iran, while sensible and a recognition of Iranian power in the region, does indicate that the U.S. understands that. Now, you have a kind of radical reactionary right-wing component of the U.S. power structure, people like John Bolton, who think we can still bomb our way into dominance. But Obama, I think, reflects a sensible approach. Does it make the world a safer place? In some minor sense, yes. But until the U.S. can recognize that its dominance is over permanently and that that's a good thing, I think we're still in a very dangerous world.
The Annie E. Casey Foundation has released a new report this morning on child poverty in the U.S. Its findings are extremely disturbing, showing that 22% of American children lived below the poverty line in 2013. That's compared to 18% in 2008. The numbers, which are based on U.S. Census data, mean that even during the recession, poverty was not as bad among children as it was in more recent years. It should be noted that the federal poverty line is extremely low to begin with, only $23,624 for a family of 4 per year in 2013. A more reasonable poverty line would include far greater numbers of struggling families. Broken down by race, a whopping 39% of African American children live in poverty, compared to the 22% average across races. Black children are the hardest hit group, with Native American children at a close second. You know, Bob, when people say all lives matter, perhaps they're ignorant of how some lives clearly seem to matter so much less in the U.S. than others, right?
It's so obvious, and statistics like this drive home how incoherent our economic system is, even by its own standards. You know, I'm a longtime critic of capitalism, but even if you take capitalism at face value, it does not live up to its own claims. What this study shows is that really about a quarter of the children, and in racial and ethnic minority groups, probably more like half, these children are out of the game from the beginning. They are not going to have the resources to compete fairly. That means this whole illusion of an opportunity society is really just that, an illusion. And that's the linchpin of contemporary capitalism. If we paid attention to these numbers, we would not only be distressed about the suffering, we would recognize that this system itself is, at this point, fundamentally incoherent.
And finally, speaking of poverty, the activist group Debt Collective pulled off a creative prank yesterday to draw attention to the high cost of higher education in the U.S. The National Association of Student Financial Aid Administrators, or NASFA, which represents, quote, 20,000 student financial assistance professionals at approximately 3,000 colleges and universities, met in New Orleans yesterday. During their meeting, Debt Collective claimed to win NASFA's Big Idea Award, saying that it had come up with a plan to fully fund all higher education institutions in the U.S. Debt Collective announced that the total amount of new money necessary would be as little as $15 billion a year. $15 billion is a fraction of 1% of yearly government spending. It is merely a rounding error in the federal budget, less than the government currently spends on tax breaks for just 20 corporations. Although Debt Collective did not actually win the award, they are dead serious about their idea of how to publicly fund higher education so that it is free to all. Bob, you are an academic. How amazing is this proposal?
Well, I think as long as we're on the theme of incoherent institutions, why not move to the modern university? First of all, let's recognize the United States is the most affluent country in the history of the world. When we talk about free higher education or eliminating child poverty, all of these things are things that can be done easily if our moral values called for them, or at least if we took seriously the moral values we claim to hold. And I think university education is just another one. Now, I'd be the first to say that the modern American university, especially big ones like the University of Texas, where I teach, are broken institutions, both in the way they're structured and in the underlying values. And there's a lot of internal house cleaning we need to do. But for now, the idea that education is the road to opportunity, if we're going to take that seriously, that road is now pretty much permanently closed to a big chunk of society, pretty much those same quarter of the children in this country who are out of the game to start. These should shake our faith in the foundational institutions. I don't think technical fixes are the road. We need to think about our values in the institutions and how those institutions do or don't reflect those values.
Bob, thanks as always for joining us. We'll talk to you again next week.
Thanks, Sonali.
Robert Jensen is an author and a professor of journalism at the University of Texas at Austin. This is Uprising. We'll be right back. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. Israel and the U.S. have once more come to loggerheads, this time over a tiny Palestinian village in the southernmost part of the West Bank, about 15 kilometers south of Hebron. The village of Kirbet Susiya is home to only 55 Palestinian families who own title to the land. Not only has Israel denied them planning rights to build on their own land, but now an Israeli court has cleared the way to simply demolish the entire village. U.S. Department spokesman John Kirby told press, quote, "We strongly urge the Israeli authorities to refrain from carrying out any demolitions in the village. Demolition of this Palestinian village or parts of it and evictions of Palestinians from their homes would be harmful and provocative." California Representative Anna Eshoo authored a letter to State Secretary John Kerry underscoring the importance of preserving the village of Susiya. Her letter was signed on to by more than a number of representatives, about 8 representatives. Meanwhile, some Israeli peace activists have joined in, taking turns sleeping at the village as a method of protection from demolition. Joining me right now is Huwaida Arraf. She is a lawyer and human rights activist, co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine, former chair of the Free Gaza Movement. Welcome to Uprising, Huwaida.
Thank you for having me, Sonali.
Can you share the history, first of all, of this small Palestinian village of Susiya with us? How far back do these families go in owning this land?
The families have been there for decades. Now, Israel claims that this is an ancient Jewish city dating back to, or a town dating back to, biblical times, and that is the reason that they give for repeated expulsion of Palestinians from their communities. And they actually went and in 1986 removed a number of Palestinians from this very village of Susiya in order to create, they declared that this was an archaeological site and demolished a number of caves that these Palestinians were living in and moved them all off of this property. Now, in terms of the actual deeds that they hold, I'm not 100% sure of the exact dating of this, but Palestinians have been on the land of Palestine for centuries. And, it was with the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948 that many Palestinians were expelled, and Israel has begun in various ways to challenge Palestinian ownership and cynically using law in order to say that Palestinians do not actually own this territory or belong here. But what we must keep in mind is that with the creation of the State of Israel, Israel established a multi-tiered legal system which clearly discriminates against Palestinians and even Palestinians that are citizens of the State of Israel. So you have a law that is for Israeli Jewish citizens, and that is meant to make the Jewish State of Israel flourish and remain and keep its Jewish character. And therefore you have perks and incentives. And this goes to also incentives for moving Jewish communities inside occupied territory and giving them all kinds of benefits. Then you have a law that is for Palestinian citizens of Israel, which is almost close to what is for Jewish citizens of Israel, but discriminates against them in a lot of ways and does not allow the same kind of development and give perks, etc., to the Palestinian citizens, because you have to keep in mind Israel does not want the Palestinian population to increase. And then you have military law that's applied to Palestinians that live in occupied territory. And this kind of law is used by Israel. The Palestinians are under complete military control, and it is used in various ways to deny them basic rights.
So you've just put this village into context, into the larger context of how Israeli occupation has worked. Would you say Susiya is sort of typical of other Palestinian villages that have, or could be sort of the precursor to villages that have already been lost, that there have been villages that were like Susiya that are now erased from history because Israel built settlements on them, demolished them, etc.?
Yes, definitely. You have, like I was saying earlier, Israel cynically uses the law to say that Palestinians can't be here, but who do they say can be there? Their own citizens, Jewish citizens that they move and put in these colonies that they establish on Palestinian land that they move Palestinians out of. And they've used it in different ways. In the case of Susiya, they said that part of it is agricultural land, and now that they've actually admitted that they are under pressure from the Israeli settlers, and these are sadly very violent settlers also. There have been documentation of these settlers attacking Palestinian villagers of Susiya with sticks and bats, and severely injuring them. But they are under pressure now from these settlers to move the rest of the Palestinians off their land. And Israel will likely use then, when they move these Palestinians off their land, use that to expand the village of Susiya, where Jewish Israelis are now at. In other areas, they have done somewhat similar. As your listeners might know, Israel has built an annexation/apartheid wall that they claimed was for security purposes, but it de facto annexed a lot of Palestinian agriculture and other land into what is Israel's, on the side of Israel, and therefore Palestinians can't get to this land anymore. And then after a few years, Israel will say, oh, well, this is abandoned land now, and they can do what they want with it. One of the things that they have started to do with this land that they have isolated from their Palestinian owners is to expand illegal settlements that have already been created on the land. And they use other tactics like this. For example, one thing that I neglected to mention is that Susiya sits in what is called Area C, based on the Oslo peace process, divided the occupied territory into A, B, and C. Area C is about 60% of the land. It is completely controlled by Israel, and Israel forbids Palestinians any kind of development in this area. They cannot build, they cannot develop their towns and cities, they cannot build homes for expanding families. And Israel also does not allow them simple things like being connected to water infrastructure. And when Palestinians try to retrieve water from wells and build cisterns, Israel comes in and demolishes them. Why? because it wants Palestinians to voluntarily move off the land. But when people like Susiya, who really do not have infrastructure, but live in caves and tents, but are intent on staying on their land and farming their land, when policies like this does not work to get them off, then Israel tries to come in and completely demolish it. And not only to Palestinians in occupied territory, but they've actually been doing somewhat similar to Palestinian citizens of Israel and demolishing communities in the south of Israel, Bedouin communities, and forcibly transferring these populations also.
So, Huwaida, you mentioned a lot of the residents of Susiya living in tents and caves. Is that specifically because Israel is refusing them permits to build, and so they don't have an option but to build or live in a tent rather than be able to actually build a real structure to live in?
Exactly. And as I mentioned a little bit earlier, they even used to live in caves. Israel demolished some of these caves. They have built tents in order to stay on their land. And this is the only home that they know, and they are attached emotionally and otherwise to the land. And again, Israel says that they cannot build on this land. They actually submitted a few years ago a sophisticated plan to develop their village, which was completely refused by Israel. So they have continued to live in these tents. Various groups have tried to help the community have regular access to water or even electricity. They're not connected to any kind of electricity grid by bringing in like solar panels, etc. And the Israeli military has also demolished and destroyed these.
Now, the court also cleared the way to formally demolish Susiya, and people have been expecting that to happen, I understand, for maybe about a month now, and it could happen any day. Is that accurate?
Yes, it is. On May 15th, just a couple of months ago, the Israeli High Court ruled to allow the military to completely demolish Susiya and forcibly transfer its population. And what is somewhat uncharacteristic of the court is that they refused to grant an interim order staying the implementation of the demolition order because the residents appealed the order, and the appeal will be heard in August, I believe August 3rd. And generally, when you do have an appeal, you stay in implementation of an order so as to not, completely render the appeal useless. But the court refused to stay the demolition, and so it could take place at any time. And so, as you mentioned, there have been groups of Israelis and international civilians that have been staying in the village in order to kind of put pressure on Israel not to demolish. They've been staying with these villagers so that we send a clear message to Israel that this village is not going to be demolished unnoticed. We are going to protest. One of the things that one of the groups actually recorded an Israeli military spokesperson as saying is that they would prefer that to come to a solution where they didn't have to have a high-profile media demolition, meaning all the media filming them demolishing this village.
Of course.
But also a solution where the residents would also not stay there at all. So basically, that's not any kind of resolution. That's just getting the Palestinians to leave.
Quietly, of course.
Quietly. And so that's why it's so important that we not, and then there's been this campaign over social media, Save Susiya, in order to raise the profile of this small village. And I think that led directly to Representative Anna Eshoo writing this Dear Colleague letter and circulating. I believe there may be 10 or 11 representatives that have signed on so far. And it's so important for people to call their members of Congress and ask them to also sign on. The more pressure we can raise, the more we can guarantee that Israel cannot or will not demolish it. But if it ultimately does, which will be devastating, that it at least is not done quietly.
So I'm glad you brought up both the Twitter campaign as well as what at least a small number of members of the U.S. Congress have been doing, the hashtag Save Susiya campaign. How important is that? I mean, and how effectively have Palestinian activists and advocates of Susiya been able to draw attention to this? Again, this is a small village, and there have been so many others like it that have been completely erased, and this seems to be an attempt to save, one of these few villages that is really vainly against all odds trying to to continue to exist? How effective are such social media campaigns in drawing international attention to this issue?
Well, I'm one of those people that believe that they are very important because it raises awareness. One of the ways that I think Israel's allowed to get away with what it gets away with is by, the amount of finances, money, resources that it invests in painting a certain image of itself as the victim here that is, completely respective of human rights, has a very moral army, and only does what it does to protect its citizens. And that is actually not what's happening. And the more that we can expose the details of the policies and expose them as not being about protecting people at all, but about colonial settler expansion that has policies that grossly violate the human rights of the indigenous Palestinians of the land, we can help to break down this image that Israel has tried to paint of itself, and that has allowed it, in a sense, legitimacy to do what it's doing, because Israel does all of these things that when other states or governments might do them would be considered, we'd go to impose sanctions on these other countries, condemn them, certainly not give them preferential treatment, certainly the United States not give them $3 billion in military aid per year and political cover of all kinds. So exposing it is kind of the first step in trying to break down this legitimacy that Israel has tried to create for itself and its policies that are so in violation of international human rights and humanitarian law, and also give impetus to the people that are trying to change the situation on the ground using effective means, using different means of popular resistance, of nonviolent resistance to try to pressure Israel. And to do that, you need people to be aware, you need people to sign on, and the more people that sign on, the more pressure that you can create. And one thing I'm specifically talking about here is the Global Boycott, Divestment, and Sanctions campaign. And exposing some of these policies for what they are, help feed information into the people that are campaigning for divestment from companies that are enabling for Israel to do what it's doing, specifically Caterpillar, for example. When Israel comes in with the bulldozers to demolish Susiya, they'll likely bring in Caterpillar bulldozers, Motorola or Hewlett-Packard that give services and technology to the Israeli military that will be demolishing this village, etc. And so this kind of social media campaigning is important because of the awareness that it raises and the mobilization that it fosters.
And some of the graffiti on the tents in Susiya have the emblem of the BDS movement, the cartoon character of the boy with his back to the world, his hands behind his back in defiance. And on the issue of how social media can raise awareness, there has started to be some mainstream media coverage as well. Reuters just posted a piece by Luke Baker, "In West Bank, Palestinians count down to their village's demolition," drawing attention to this. Now, let's talk about how specifically the State Department, we mentioned a handful of members of Congress signing on to the letter by Representative Anna Issue urging Israel not to demolish this village. And, there's generally been small numbers of representatives in the U.S. Congress willing to do this, put themselves out there, like John Conyers, Keith Ellison, etc. But even the State Department and John Kerry, well, not John Kerry specifically, but the State Department spokesperson John Kirby said that the U.S. has very specifically raised the issue of this village to Israel. How important is that? Because on the one hand, of course, we've talked about relations on the surface between the U.S. and President Obama, between Israel and President Obama deteriorating in these past few months. But does the State Department statement warning Israel against demolishing this village indicate a real break between U.S. policy and Israeli policy, or is this just lip service?
Well, I think this statement is a start, but obviously I don't think it goes far enough, because the actions of the United States government remain that, it continues to give Israel $3 billion in military aid. It is actually contemplating now an Israeli request for a 50% increase in that military aid. So we're talking about Israel possibly getting $4.5 billion per year in military aid, which will obviously enable it to continue with these kinds of policies. And then the United States gives Israel political cover when the United Nations Security Council tries to pass resolutions that might actually have some meat behind it, calling on Israel or at least imposing some kind of repercussions for Israel continuing its policies. So a public declaration, a statement is important, but we should be looking more for Israel, for the United States to put some meat behind its statements and actually tie some of its policies, its foreign assistance, its political relations with Israel to Israel actually ceasing these human rights violations.
And Huwaida, I understand that a spokesperson from Susiya, one of the sort of part of the leadership there, has sent also an open letter to the EU, the European Union, to suspend their trade agreements with Israel over the impending demolition of Susiya. Does that sort of action also, have an impact? What is the EU's position on this?
I think that these kinds of things are very important because EU's Israel's biggest trading partner, and therefore suspension of economic trade with Israel would have a big economic impact on Israel. And I think that these are the kinds of actions that need to be taken. There was recently an EU report that came out, and it calls on Israel. It addresses the situation in Gaza and also mentions the situation in the West Bank, Susiya specifically, calling on Israel to cease any plans to demolish Susiya and forcibly remove its residents from the area, which again is a start. When you issue reports, it's good to see that there is some kind of acknowledgement, that there is documentation, but we do need policies tied to these statements to back them up. Otherwise, Israel will do what it has done for decades, which is completely ignore all of these statements that come out from the EU, lip service from the United States, all of these human rights organizations that have been for decades documenting these kinds of abuses, and Israel just kind of not even turns a blind eye, but it ignores and sometimes even tries to come back and label these institutions as biased against Israel. But when you start to tie policies to these statements that are made, it's you demolish and we will suspend our trade agreements with you. I think these will start having the impact that we need to see.
Finally, and very briefly, do you think Israel is planning on simply waiting out the media coverage and public attention to Susiya before bringing the bulldozers in?
Unfortunately, we've seen this happen many times, and it could possibly happen here. So what we do is urge people not to let this happen. We're taking our cue from people on the ground. I haven't been to Susiya in a number of years now, but the community is so welcoming with the little that they have. Just beautiful people, and I hope that we can all help them stay on their land and keep their homes. And so if people will, if they're on Twitter and Facebook, look up Susiya and messages on the ground from what's happening there, we can make sure that the media attention doesn't die out as long as there is a conceivable threat. So we're hoping that as a result of this pressure that we're trying to raise, that we're raising, that the demolition order will be canceled. But as long as it's not, let's keep up the pressure.
And Susiya is spelled Susiya. Some also simply spell it Susya. The hashtag Save Susiya is the campaign, and we will post a link to that on our website later. Thanks so much, Huwaida, for your work and for joining us.
Thank you for sharing, Sonali.
My guest is Huwaida Arraf. She is a lawyer and a human rights activist and co-founder of the International Solidarity Movement in Palestine, former chair of the Free Gaza Movement. This is Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kohatkar. We turn now to Mumia Abu Jamal, an award-winning journalist and political prisoner whose latest book is entitled Writing on the Wall. Here is Mumia reading a section from that book, which includes essays spanning his career.
An essay from the new book, Writing on the Wall, Gangsters in Blue, July 20, 1994. A ruthless band of criminals strikes a series of homes, robbing inhabitants of money and other valuables, threatening certain violence to those who dare to tell. A greedy group of thugs forces young people to hit the streets to sell drugs for them and will beat and even shoot them if they don't produce profits fast enough. A brutal bunch of armed rapists attacks and sexually assaults a group of defenseless women. These and other events happened in New York and in Philadelphia recently, proof positive of an ugly crime wave in those and several other cities perpetrated by gangsters in blue, members of the police department. The recently released Mullen Commission report, which deals with several aspects of corruption, crime, and cop violence in the New York Police Department, tells of cops shaking down drug dealers, beating them, and shooting them. For instance, in one reference, the report noted that Officer Alfonso Campres not only allegedly robbed a drug dealer, but shot him in the stomach to steal his drugs. Not, the author might add, as evidence, but for resale, or even for his own use. Some cops, the report adds, are violent simply for the sake of violence. As an example, the commission document cited a case from Brooklyn North Precinct in which cops threw a bucket of ammonia at a person being detained in a holding pen. Another cop, known as the mechanic, because he tuned people up, routinely beat folks up, visiting indiscriminate violence upon all, young or old, male or female. One cop, testifying before the commission when asked by the commissioner whether such violence prompted complaints from aggrieved citizens, replied, "Who are they going to complain to? The police? We are the police." And the killing of those who claim to serve and protect goes on. The deadly toll, 412 people killed by cops in 1976, 333 in 1984, 385 in 1990. They obviously haven't served or protected the thousands they've murdered over the years. So who do they serve and protect? They serve and protect the system, not the people. To the people, they are predators who take the health, the property, the freedom, and the lives of the very people who, through their tax dollars, pay their bloated salaries. They are blue uniformed vampires who live on the blood and misery of the many. They are the best criminals of all. An essay from the new book, Writing on the Wall. This is its author. From Imprisoned Nation, this is Mumia Abu Jamal. These commentaries are recorded by Noel Hanrahan of Prison Radio.
Mumia Abu Jamal is an award-winning journalist and a political prisoner, and you can find out more about his work online at prisonradio.org. On Saturday afternoon in Phoenix, Arizona, thousands of people gathered at the Netroots Nation conference when two activists with the Black Lives Matter movement, Patrisse Cullors and Tia Oso, interrupted Democratic presidential candidate Martin OMalley during his appearance. OMalley clumsily retorted that Black Lives Matter, White Lives Matter, All Lives Matter, for which he later apologized. Then, when Senator Bernie Sanders appeared on stage, he too was interrupted, and he responded by saying, "I spent 50 years of my life fighting for civil rights and dignity, but if you don't want me to be here, that's okay. I don't want to outscream people." Black Lives Matter, ahead of a major national gathering in Cleveland, are challenging both these candidates about why they have not made racial justice a central part of their political platforms. Joining me now is Kevin AlexanderGrain. He's a longtime civil rights activist who co-edited the book Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. Welcome to Uprising.
Hey, Sonali, I'm sorry. I have a lot of things going on at my house today, including getting my air conditioning repaired.
Well, we appreciate you taking the time to join us. Well, first, let's talk about what you make of what happened on Saturday. It's generated a lot of conversation that these activists from Black Lives Matter would challenge not just Democratic Party candidates, but the liberal-most Democratic Party candidates. What do you make of it?
Well, look, both candidates, all candidates ought to have an agenda that deals with the issues that the Black community are grappling with right now, to include police violence, to include economics, to include all the issues that the Black Lives Matter activists raised. The problem with the candidates starts at the top, to include Bernie Sanders. They ought to hire Black people to advise them in their campaigns instead of just organizing that group of white men, which Bernie Sanders is guilty of doing too, and letting those people try to filter what it is that the candidates get. Bernie has a great economic message. His foreign policy message as it relates to Israel and Palestine isn't one that I can buy into. But obviously Bernie Sanders and Martin OMalley have a whole lot to do to try to get the Black voters to pay attention to them. And, you know, they better be ready for the confrontation. Now, if Bernie Sanders' response to people that raise questions about where he stands on the issues, be it Israel and Palestine or the police and Black Lives Matter and civil rights, if his tact is going to be to yell at people and to think that he can talk over them and be a grumpy old man, he'll lose a lot of support.
Kevin, I want to play for you and our audience a short clip of the first interruption at Netroots Nation when Martin OMalley was speaking. Let's watch this.
We're tired of being interrupted. The governor is going to be able to speak. We know that he's been here. We also know that Senator Bernie Sanders is back there. We appreciate you listening to us and the audience holding space for us. But let me be clear. Every single day, folks are dying. Not being able to take another breath. We are in a state of emergency. We are in a state of emergency. And if you don't feel that emergency, you are not human. I see you. Give me a second.
You want to get your question?
Yes.
Go ahead, Patrice.
We have 4 questions.
Patrice, one question.
The question we have, and I'll just mix all my 4 questions into one if that's what you want to do. It really boils down to the fight for Black and brown lives. It really boils down to not what you have done, but what you will do. What will you do to stop police unions battering our names after their law enforcement kills us? I want to hear concrete actions. I want to hear an action plan. That's what we want to hear, and we want to hear it from Bernie Sanders too.
All right, thank you. Thank you.
Patrice Cullors, co-founder of Black Lives Matter, with a hoarse voice there, and she and many others are heading as we speak to Cleveland. Kevin Gray, she challenged not just those men on the stage, Martin OMalley and backstage Bernie Sanders, but also the audience, a very progressive but still largely white liberal audience. How important was that?
Well, look, liberals have this feeling of self-righteousness that because they're liberals, they're on Black people's sides, and that really doesn't ever translate into anything of substance. What the young lady is talking about is the fact that what we're going through with the police departments across the country, with the militarization of police and the demonization of Black people in general, not just Black men, but Black women, not just young, but old. And then when we see it, the peak of violence with what happened at Emmanuel. I mean, if you think, right now there's, I think, an estimated 600 deaths that have occurred since the first of the year of people of color by the police department. And now we see what happened with the 9 people murdered at Emmanuel. Well, it's been building, and we see the hate and the animosity. It is crucial that we deal with the fact that we've got an over-militarized police department, that for the most part, Black people are demonized or stereotyped as thugs, and Latino people are stereotyped as illegal, and Arabs are stereotyped as terrorists. We can see the difference in how police departments across the country respond to Black people, such as they did with the Becton teenager in McKinney, Texas, as opposed to Dylan Roof. In the case of the pool party in McKinney, they brought out a police, the officer Casebolt pulled out his gun on those kids. And we see when they arrested Dylan Roof, they holstered their guns and took them to get a hamburger before they took him to jail. If we look at what they did in the case in Chattanooga, where the 5 servicemen were killed, the police immediately sent an armored vehicle to that family home and declared that man a terrorist and had his family come out with their hands up. Right. In the case of Dylan Roof, they sent police to protect his house and to keep people away. So that's an example of skin privilege. They've got to deal with the fact that the police department are routinely stereotyping people, and police departments have had little safeguards on their behavior. Grand juries and prosecutors have really been reluctant to prosecute people. In South Carolina, I'm glad to say that in the case of Walter Scott, the police in North Charleston responded quickly, and we prosecuted police officers who have been accused of misconduct in office here in South Carolina. But we've got to push for body cameras that police can't turn on and off when they want to. We've got to move to demilitarizing police departments. We've got to set up citizens review boards that have the power to subpoena, that are independent. And we have to generally look at reforming police departments across the country to end this military to police pipeline.
Now, Kevin, the candidates, Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, haven't done much more beyond pay lip service to racial justice issues, but Hillary Clinton has had a whole speech on it. Her husband considered the first Black president, and she is, I think, taking for granted that she is going to be able to win over the Black vote. And I'm wondering if you hope that the Black Lives Matter activists challenge her. Of course, it might be much harder to get on stage at a Hillary Clinton event than at a Bernie Sanders or Martin O'Malley event.
And there you have it. And Hillary Clinton and Bill Clinton, because of their relationship with the Black community, are already in the Black community. They're spreading money. They're hiring people. Look, Bernie Sanders can't even figure out to hire somebody at the top echelons of his campaign. He has to come into South Carolina that's considered the Black primary. He hasn't hired anybody in his campaign. He's got problems that he has to solve at the top. So, I think what the issues that the young folk are raising are all valid issues. They've got to step up to the plate, or they don't deserve the support. Now, when you talk about Bill Clinton and Hillary Clinton, of course they're hypocrites. Bill Clinton signed that 1992 Criminal Justice Act. That might not be the appropriate name for it, but Bill Clinton's record is he put more Black people in jail than Ronald Reagan, and now he's coming back years after office saying he was wrong. He was wrong on a whole lot of stuff.
Also, a lot of the criticism of Bernie Sanders is, even though his economic justice agenda is so impressive, he is using class as a cover for speaking about race, or trying to avoid speaking about race. What do you make of that?
Look, obviously a lot of the issues in this country go beyond race, and it does go to class and economics. But as the Black Lives Matter activists raised with Bernie Sanders and Martin O'Malley, this is about Black economic development and Blacks being a constituency that people have to address as well. Mm-hmm. It's not just a matter of him saying, well, I got your back because I'm on the class issue, and if we talk class, it's all going to be okay. The differentiation is that Black people are still identified and profiled by skin color. And he needs to deal with that straight up.
And in fact, there was a report just this morning on child poverty in the U.S. Where 22% of American children are found to have been below the poverty line in 2013. But for Black children specifically, that number jumped to 39%. Now, out of the Netroots Nation confrontation, Kevin, came the response on Twitter with the hashtag Bernie So Black, where a lot of Black Twitter users took Bernie Sanders to task. Here's a sampling of what they said. Hashtag Bernie So Black. He was the founder of SNCC, the Black Panther Party, and the SCLC. Hashtag Bernie So Black. He helped Malcolm X sell bean pies on his 125th this first week he got out of prison. Hashtag Bernie So Black. He single-handedly laid the tracks for the Underground Railroad. What do you make of these responses?
Hey, look, if you're not going to really take people seriously, then they're going to ridicule you and not take you serious. Bernie Sanders is the most liberal candidate in the Democratic field. Of course, the most liberal candidate out there is Jill Stein, but Jill Stein and the Green Party have yet to figure out how to organize in the Black community and how to organize beyond campaigns to be strong enough to compete with the major parties when primary season, election season rolls around. But no doubt, Bernie Sanders, minus where he stands on Israel, because that's just awful, is the most liberal Democratic candidate out there. And it would seem to me that he would, as I said, it does start with hiring people around you so that you know how to have the conversation. It isn't just about being introduced by Nichols of the state, and that being of the nation, and that being the deal, or having a coterie of white guys travel around with you. You've got to get in there and meet people and have a personal, as personal as you can have in a political race. You know, that's the problem. He doesn't really seem to have personal kind of ties with the Black community so that he can translate that into the political language that he needs to use on the stump.
Now, Kevin, one of the hashtags that I saw was really grim, but is a good segue into the next topic. Hashtag Bernie So Black. His daughter died under mysterious circumstances in a jail. Among the things that activists did on stage at the Netroots Nation conference was chant the names of Black women in particular who have been killed in police custody or who've died under mysterious circumstances, and then we've been told that they committed suicide. Women in particular, like Sandra Bland. Attorney General Loretta Lynch, the first Black female Attorney General, is being asked to look into Bland's death. And just today, we are finding out that her death is going to be investigated as a murder, which certainly does speak to the power of social media. What do you think of this conversation around the death of Sandra Bland and the fact that it's finally making waves?
Well, look, I always cite the case of 92-year-old Katherine Johnson in Atlanta, when police busted in her house in the middle of the night, and she pulled out a gun and they killed her and they tried to plant drugs on her. Or even a Yana Jones in Detroit. The list goes on and on. It's not just Black people. It's not just men. It's men and women. It's Native Americans. No one's talking about the increase in deaths by police of Native Americans. It's Latino people. It's basically police departments out of control. Yeah. And anytime you have someone who's stopped for a minor traffic violation, this Sandra Bland was stopped for failure to use her turn signal. Now, I don't know where in the law books that failure to use your turn signal should result in the death penalty. This is all about police claiming to be afraid for their lives and killing people. Now, they claim she committed suicide with plastic bags, and I'm glad there's an investigation. But a traffic stop ought not result in the death penalty for anybody.
And they are now saying, the police are saying that the Dashcam video of her arrest will be made public, and we'll certainly know more at that time. But apparently she was ordered out of her car after a police officer became annoyed that she was smoking in her own car, and she started filming her encounter, because we know from her Facebook post that she was very aware of police brutality aimed at African Americans. She was outspoken in her support for the Black Lives Lives Matter movement. And according to, the spokesperson for her family, this is what happened, that she was essentially starting to try to film what happened. She was in Texas because she had just gotten a new job. She was there, she had already gotten the job. And all of a sudden, we are expected to believe she was so depressed that after 3 days in jail, when cops, after cops pulled her out, abused her on the sidewalk, that she would commit suicide. I mean, it's incredible.
Well, sadly, it's not new that police will hurt you when they stop you or kill you. It's not news. It's sad news, of course, that people die under mysterious circumstances in jailhouses. Of course, I don't buy the police's story when the news is coming out about the prosecutor and the sheriff in the department having a history of abusing people of color. And so I hope all of this comes out. It's not going to bring Sandra Bland back, but hopefully it will result in charges against these officers that were responsible for her care. And somebody ought to go to jail for that young lady dying under those circumstances in that Texas jail.
The story also spawned another Twitter campaign, #IfIDieInPoliceCustody. And I'm wondering if you've seen that, just a heartbreaking Twitter trend where people, expressed the real fear that they have, in particular that African Americans have, of being pulled over for the most minor of reasons and never emerging alive.
I mean, and you hear it when people defend the police, well, you ought to do what they say. The police are not the law. The police are not above the law. They are to administrate the law and serve as peace officers. They should be, their first order of duty should be to protect the public. And the public includes the people that they pull over. Anybody that dies because of a traffic stop, we ought to be investigating those kinds of incidents, and we ought to view them as crimes, because for that young lady to be stopped for failure to use a signal light and end up dead is just horrible, and someone ought to be held accountable.
Now, let's talk about the fact that it's been a year since Eric Garner was killed, almost a year since Michael Brown was killed. And other than a shift in awareness, largely thanks to the Black Lives Matter movement, there hasn't really been any significant real change. You pointed out Walter Scott, where because of the right people being in office, you might have the semblance of the beginnings of some kind of accountability, but still, yet, nobody in jail, no indictments, right?
Well, see,
no convictions, I should say.
Listen, I give Black Lives Matters credit for young people getting involved in the movement and stepping up to be the point of the spear, as they say. Now, it's more than just going, holding up signs and disrupting meetings or speeches. You've got to go to the meetings. You've got to engage the people in power. You have to engage the community. You have to engage older people in the community. Now, they get a lot of credit for bringing attention to things, but there are people that work throughout the community, have long worked throughout the community, that deserve credit also. So they're, as I said, they're the tip of the spear, but they're not the whole spear. And part of what they need to learn to do is build coalitions with community people across generational lines. I mean, I think that that's a major problem, and they need to learn. Well, from my perspective as an organizer, how do you organize beyond your brand? Because the other issue that people have with Black Lives Matter is they act as a brand. They move to protect that brand, and in moving to protect that brand, it limits other people's involvement with them. And so, I mean, and there are generational issues, no doubt, but everybody is at risk when they're pulled over by police. It's not just the young. As I said, it's the young, it's the old, it's brown. We've got to talk about coalition building, and we've got to talk about public education beyond, as I said, just doing the events that get you on TV or the events where you're basically acting out the same model that a lot of us criticize, a messianic kind of charismatic model. We need to go beyond that and start building structures within the community that can go to the meetings, that can challenge the police, that can file lawsuits, that can go to churches and meet with the ministers and meet with these congregations and do teach-ins, and then go to the communities where the people are most at risk, the poorer communities, like those that you see in Ferguson or those that you see in most inner city neighborhoods around the country. That takes a different kind of mass organizing. And so I'm not seeing that happen, but I'm seeing the beginnings of it.
Well, finally, Patrisse Cullors, in her interruption on stage of Martin O'Malley, did say, she mentioned Black and Brown lives, and there is a coalition building between Latino communities and African American communities and the Black Lives Matter movement, but you're saying that there's a bit of a generational divide that needs to be bridged. How do you respond to those who say, well, clergy have been organizing, the older generation who were directly and personally involved in the civil rights movement have let young folks down from their perspective? I'm playing devil's advocate here. We have about a minute left. Yeah.
Well, you know what? People do what they have to do. And I started out doing this stuff when I was young. A lot of the older people started out doing what they did when they were young. Of course, we've had school desegregation and socialization unlike it was when I was growing up. So this idea that older folk let people down, older folk work jobs, older folk try to send their kids to college, older folk do the best they can to be involved in politics. Most often, just like in wars, young people are the fuel of movement. People have to reach out to one another instead of trying to blame each other for what's lacking in our community. They're lacking this accountability that we've got to hold police to these days. But it means that we've got to come together and stop criticizing what it is that each other brings to the table. We've got to sit down and have common ground and bridge that generational divide.
And of course, we should say this is a very young movement. It's only been 1 year since the formation of Black Lives Matter, and so certainly a long.
And it's yet to be determined if it's a movement.
I want to thank you so much, Kevin, for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
My guest, Kevin AlexanderGrain, is a longtime civil rights activist. He co-edited the new book, Killing Trayvons, an anthology of American violence. And that does it for our program today. This is Uprising. Anna Buss is our assistant producer and technical director. Christian Beck is our production coordinator. Kiana Turner is our visual editor, research intern, and audio engineer. Also special thanks to Teddy Robinson for audio engineering and to Jonathan Alexander for technical assistance. Annie Mendoza is our social media coordinator. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/uprising with Sonali. Your subscription sustains the TV production of Uprising. Our website is uprisingwithsonali.com. Our theme music is by Quetzal. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar, host and executive producer of Uprising. I'll see you next time.